You can create really interesting imagery in Photoshop. You can create composites, you can apply effects, and even do 3D imagery. But it's important to have the image that you're working with correct as far as color is concerned before you spend all the other time creating your final composition. In this lesson, you're going to discover some fundamentals that are going to help you color correct your images. Now, I have PS0701 open, and I also have PS0701 done because I want to show you the difference. This image has been color corrected, and you can see by looking at it that his skin looks a lot more healthy than it does in this image, where there's a little bit of a blue tint. And this is the way the image was originally shot or taken. It has what's called a bit of a color cast on it, and this color cast can make your image look dirty. And a lot of times this happens due to the light or perhaps the camera that you've used. But it's a color that has been introduced into this image that I want to get rid of. So here's how I'm going to get started. I'm first of all going to do a little cheat because the first stage of creating any good image and using the tone curve, which is what we're going to use, is finding the light and dark point of this image. So you'll notice that I'm going under Image Adjustment Threshold. Now there is a way you can do this in levels and also curves, but I'm going to have you step by step set the highlight and shadow in threshold because it's a little bit easier to mark or sample the areas that are the lightest and darkest in your image using this dialog box. So you'll notice that as a default, threshold will turn what's darker than 50% gray into black and less than 50% gray into white. The reason I'm using it is as a cheat to slide this over to the right and find the lightest point of this image that's important to me. So if I turn off and on this preview, I can see that her hat is coming up as the lightest, but also the flames over here, and he's pretty much the primary focus of this image. So I'm going to go ahead, hold down my shift key, and mark my white point on that flame. Now here's the thing that you want to be careful with. If you are looking at an image and has a really bright spot, like maybe it's a piece of jewelry or a bumper reflecting or a fire or the sunlight in the sky, you want to skip that and slide over a little bit more until you find something that is not what's called a specular highlight. A specular highlight should remain bright white in your image so it gives it good definition and it doesn't affect the rest of your tone curve. You don't want to pick that as the lightest point of your image when you're working with curves because we're going to actually go in and define this as a dot area up here. And I don't want to ruin a specular highlight, but I also don't want to blow out the rest of my image. So again, the big rule is do not pick something that is bright and shiny as the lightest point of your image. Ignore it and slide on in until you find the next thing. Now I want to find the dark area. So I'm sliding this to the left and I can see the darkest area up here. And I'm also shift clicking to go ahead and mark that. Here's the big thing you want to remember. Cancel. If you click OK, it's not a big deal. You can press Control or Command Z. It'll undo the changes here, but it will still keep your samples. But I want to cancel this. And my color samplers disappear, but they will appear depending upon the tool I have selected. So you can see if I'm on a painting or editing tool, they come back. I don't need to see them right now. That's okay. Next step, I'm going to tuck away my info panel for right now and pull out layers. And I'm going to click on New Adjustment Layer and select Curves. The reason I use curves is because curves gives me the opportunity to do a lot of the things that you can do in levels, but also things that you can do with color like hue and saturation and brightness and contrast. So you want to do as few edit changes to your image as possible, and you want to make them right the first time. Otherwise, what happens is you start to degrade or destroy your image content. So in here, I've got the curves window open, and you also see that I have highlight and shadow. And you also see that I have a highlight eyedropper and a shadow eyedropper. I'm going to double click on this highlight eyedropper, and I'm just going to put a default value in. Now keep in mind, I am working in RGB. And you should always work in RGB when you're doing color correction if that's the way the image is coming to you. It won't do a whole lot of good to you if it already comes to you CMYK, but you want to work in RGB as long as you can. And if you're sending your image out to a printer that insists that you send them a CMYK image, make sure your color settings are set up correctly and change that mode when you're done working on the image. There's more about that in the book. There's more about that in Lesson 7 in the book. So I'm clicking OK, just giving it a default highlight. And the reason I'm giving it any dot value is so that I don't have the lightest point of my image being extremely bright when it's really not supposed to, like on that flame of that cap. I'm asked if I want to save the new target colors, and I click yes. Now the shadow, I don't really have to set this if I have my color settings set correctly. So if I go under Edit and I choose Color Settings, and I know that I'm going to go out to pre-press or print this, I should select it here. If I'm going out to web or internet, I should select that here. I'm going to indicate that I'm going out to pre-press. And obviously there's a lot of things that you can change in here, and you'll find more information about this in Chapter 7. But when I click OK, my black point is set to be the best it can be for pre-press output. So now what do? Just going to rearrange my windows here a little bit so you can see it a little better. I'm taking the highlight eyedropper and I'm saying this is my highlight, and you can already see a little bit of a change here. That's because it's balancing those colors. And if I take the shadow eyedropper and click in the shadow, you can see a little change there as well. So maybe a little bit of color correction and contrast has been changed now. Okay, so I might want to visually go in and adjust the contrast here and also lighten up the midtones. So I'm going into the curves, and you'll notice that I can adjust the midtone just ever so slightly. I'm going to pull this up a bit to lighten that image. And I'm also going to go into the darker area here, the 3/4 tones, and pull this down to add a little bit of a contrast, not too much. Now, here's the thing when you work in RGB. You'll notice my tone curve is going from black to white, which means this is the darker area and this is the lighter area. If you're used to using print corrections, you might want to come up to the panel menu, select Curves Display Options, and choose to see the Curves panel based upon pigment instead of light, and click OK. Now once I've made this change, the next thing I want to do is make sure my colors are balanced. I'm going to go ahead and click once on my foreground color to show you something. If I put in equal amounts of RGB, it doesn't matter what color system I choose to enter my values into, but what I want you to see is that there's a little trick here that if you have equal amounts of RGB, red, green, blue, that it produces gray no matter what. So if I put 200, 200, 200, it's a lighter gray because the more light you have, the lighter the color. If I put 100, 100, 100, it produces a darker gray. So how does this help me? I can just take my info palette, and if I go under Window Info, I can just drag around here and I can read my color values. And you can see your color samplers have already been put here for your highlight and shadow. We're not really looking at those right now. What I'm looking at is this first value. And if I go down to something that I know is gray, like his shirt for instance, I can see that the color values, if you look up in this section, when I go back, the color values are 213, 229, and 236, which isn't really balanced. In fact, I've got a little too much blue and not quite enough red. And so typically what I like to do is to take the middle value, green, not because it's in between RGB, but because that value at 229 is in between 213 and 236. So you're looking at that value beyond that slash. The value you see before the slash is before you went and made edit changes. The value after the slash is after you've gone in and made some curve changes. So I'm going back to my layers and clicking on my adjustment layer. And the reason I use an adjustment layer is so, of course, I can turn this off and on at any time. But I'm going to take my set gray point. This is another easy way of neutralizing your image. I like to do this by hand sometimes too, just taking the RGB inside the curve panel. So I'm just going to take this Set the Gray, and I'm going to go down into a shadow area of this shirt because I don't want to pick something too light. You can see that's too bright. But here about a middle gray, and you'll see that it balances my image. And now if I go up to my layers panel and I turn off and on that visibility, you can see quite the change in this image. He looks a lot more healthy in this image than he did prior to that change. In this lesson, you learn some steps to help create a better image.